Samuel chapter 5. I still have last week's sermon up here. In case any of you missed anything, I'd be happy to share it with you. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. I like to try to make this real to you. The words that are given here are cryptic. And what I mean by that is that they're very brief. They only say what happened. They didn't say how anybody felt about what was happening and what impact it might have had upon the people there. I don't know. I think this is probably a big deal. I mean, when they came down from northern Israel to anoint David king, I think emotions were running high. There was a lot of joy. There was a lot of anticipation. There was a lot of relief. And then there were some concerns too. Things had not gone smoothly. You'll remember that David was anointed to be king of Israel way back in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, when Samuel came to his home and asked for the sons to make a review in front of him, and he was waiting for God to indicate which one of the sons would be the new king of Israel, because Saul had sinned against the Lord and proven himself on a number of occasions to be unworthy of being king. Saul was his own king. He was like the kings that surrounded Israel. And he was not one that was pleasing to God because he didn't look to God for his leadership. And so David was anointed as king a number of years ago. And so what do you suppose he might have been thinking as the moment was arriving? What do you suppose he might have been thinking as men came with their generals would come, elders would come, and soldiers would come all down to Hebron for this humongous event? I don't know, I think David, because we know him a little bit, we can speak a bit about what he was thinking. David was a humble man. David wasn't taking anything for granted. David loved God with all of his heart, and he loved Israel with all of his heart too. He was a true patriot. I don't know about you, but have you noticed that patriotic things are taking a back seat these days? And that's kind of a shameful thing. Patriots are kind of look at that as being, eccentrics, and people to be, kind of watch them, make sure that they don't do something they shouldn't do. But in this period, David was a patriot. He loved his country. He loved his people. His country was developing. Year by year, it was becoming more and more powerful at times, and then it got weak again as Philistines would attack. But there was this forward motion in the upward and downward part of the graph, and that was moving gradually up as God was working out his plan in Israel. And this was a major milestone as these people were coming from northern Israel, David was taking the stock of all of this and saying, God, I can't believe. Well, we don't know what he said. I'm just telling you what I think he might have said. I can't believe that I'm part of this. I can't believe that you have included me in the reunification of Israel. And that finally we're going to have a kingdom in which you will rule as King Almighty. And I will serve you as your servant. And I will be shepherd over Israel. Lord, I don't feel worthy of this. I don't feel capable of doing these things. But one thing I have learned is that you are with me. He had learned that, as you know, and over the years as Saul was pursuing him all over Israel. He had been accused of treason, a fine thing for somebody who's just been anointed to be king. You would have thought that things would run more smoothly. I mean, the God of Israel, who does miracles, who brought them out of Egypt, surely he could have run this a little more smoothly. That when David was anointed, there would be a short distance between that and being crowned king. But there was a long road between that, and it was a rough road. And at times it seemed unfair and unfathomable that this is the way it should be going. God, are you really sure that you've called me to this? Am I really going to become king? And if so, how am I going to rule this nation? I can't even find a place to lay my head. I'm all the time running. All the time I'm thinking about where's the next place we're going to be. When Saul's men finds out where we are, he's been chased like a common criminal. He has been nearly killed on a number of occasions. I don't know, we're not used to these kinds of things, are we? I mean, how many of you have literally been afraid for your life that somebody would kill you? This was David's regular kind of life for quite a long time. He had been betrayed by his own countrymen. Even if people from Judah had sent emissaries up to Saul to say, he's down here, you come down, we'll help you find him. You know, what's that? I thought they were on my side. It's when your friends are turning against you, you feel really rejected, and certainly he did it as well. He had been driven into exile with the Philistines. No way he could go to the place where the ark rested, and no way he could go to the tent of meeting and worship and sacrifice and worship God like he'd been so regular at doing. He was denied all that, and he had to live amongst the enemies of Israel. He had nearly lost his wife and children. As you remember, he lived in Ziklag for a while, and while he was away, thinking that he was going to have to fight beside the Philistines, and perhaps maybe he was plotting to attack them in the middle of the battle, who knows. But while he was away for that week, his wives and children, and all the wives and children of his men were taken away, and they were scared because they thought they had lost them forever. And yet God had restored them all, and restored them with great amount of the booty of battle. He was a rich man, and he came back to Israel that way, and God brought him back into Hebron. He had to fight against his own brother Israelites, as Abner had pulled together an army of all the tribes of the northern aspect of Israel, and they came against David. And you remember that David's men won that battle, but the whole idea of fighting against Israelites was so repulsive and repugnant to them. And couldn't it have been easier? God, did it have to be like this? But God had built things into David's life through all of these experiences. Perhaps some of us could go and say, you know what, Lord, I understand some of that myself. I felt like somebody who was an outcast. I felt like people were against me with unjust reasons for it. And they were looking for some way to make me fall and some way to ruin my life. Lord, I understand those kinds of things. I remember also being in something like captivity, being away from everything that I held dear. We moved, and everything that I loved and wanted was gone. Well, we may understand some of those feelings, but God has indeed in David's life, and in yours most likely as well, has used those times to turn your trust to him, so that you would say, Lord, you have been my portion. You have been the one that I found to be the closest, the one that does not ever leave me, and the one who does always understand me, and who will continue to love me and keep me because you are committed to me. Well, finally, the word of the Lord was being fulfilled. Here in Hebron, there were caravan after caravan of elders and soldiers and people coming so that they might say something significant to David. Something like, we are your own flesh and blood. Do you remember that in Deuteronomy chapter 17 that was one of the requirements of a king for Israel, that he would not be someone who was a foreigner, but he had to be chosen among those who were of Israelite background. He had to be of the same flesh and blood. And I think probably these people were saying this as well as they were saying, David, we're tired of this concept of civil war. Well, this is wrong. We should not be doing this. And David, we come here to embrace you. We want you to know that we consider ourselves to be of the same flesh and blood. You are our brother. We're very much aware that while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord, we know now, the Lord had said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. This is significant not only in the sense that they are saying, we are one with you, we embrace you, you are one of us, and we want to be one together. But we also know that you are chosen of God. They have been denying that for quite a long time. But now they've come to the place where God has removed all the other options, all the other family of Saul's descent that could indeed raise an army against David. And they were saying, we now realize that God has pointed to you. You are the one that should lead us. And so David makes a covenant with the Israelites. An important covenant, most likely a covenant from the Torah. David was very much aware of the Torah. That is the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses. He understood the law and he followed the law carefully. And so he would have used something out of the law of Moses in fashioning this compact, this covenant, this promise that he was going to say to them. Why was it necessary? I mean, after all, wasn't he powerful enough to have been king without it? I mean, why did he need this piece of paper? Well, in Deuteronomy 17, if you want to turn there with me, in Deuteronomy 17, beginning with verse 14, God outlines what the responsibilities ought to be of Israel when they choose a king. And in it, embedded in it, is what the king ought to be doing. We'll start with verse 14, and what he says is, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. They did that. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. God gave them a king in Saul that was like all the kings around them. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt, or get more of them, for the Lord has told you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests, who are Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of his law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. And then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. Interesting what he says here. Some of these things are going to apply to his son far more than they do to David. And we'll see why Solomon's kingdom collapsed after he died, because of the way he did not follow the things that were written in this law. So thinking about this law, how would he have written? What would he have said? I think the covenant would sound something like this: I will write a copy of the law. You see, I understand that the law of God is to be my guide in how I should be a king. This is true of every leader who serves the Lord in any capacity. Are you a father? Are you a mother? Are you a boss in some business? Are you a teacher? Are you a friend, and are you a counselor? Whatever it may be, there needs to be the same commitment. If I am going to serve God in some area of responsibility, I need to know what His Word says so that I might follow it when it applies to my life. Many of us are comfortable with saying, well, I didn't obey that basically because I didn't know it was in the Bible. And that doesn't appear to be an excuse that God accepts, because He says that you need to read it, learn it, study it, so that then you might obey it. He says, I will write a copy of the law. What a wonderful way to remember the Bible. Perhaps some of us ought to do that. Let's just sit down and every day write a whole page, 8.5 by 11. Just write the Bible, copy it, think about it as we write it. I will read it all the days of my life, so that what? I will learn to revere God, because I serve Him. He is worthy of my reverence. He is the one who has ordained me to do these things. And I cannot do them without an improper relationship to Him. It is to be in the context of worship of Him. And so I will read it so that I might worship the Lord. I will revere Him, so that I will follow His words in His law carefully, so that I will not consider myself better than my brothers. Wow, there's something practical. Being a king of Israel would have kind of a heady influence to us. We might get the feeling that, we are privileged, special in some way or another. And he says, I will try my best not to develop that kind of an attitude. I think the last thing he might say was, I will lead you to do what the Lord your God created you to be. That's in direct contrast to Saul, who was promoting his own kingdom, promoting his own lordship over men, and he was continually struggling with their allegiance, always feeling paranoid over whether people were behind him or not. He kept making mistakes, and he kept getting in trouble with God and getting in trouble with Samuel, but he chose not to change his ways and submit to the Lord and make the Lord the first aspect of his life. And so his decline continued. Did David really mean this? I mean, you know what? He could have just said these things because the people expected them. I don't know. There may have been some presidents who have taken the oath of office and really didn't think too much about what they were saying. They weren't really thinking that I will follow this in my administration. I think David did. One of the reasons why I think he did was because he carried it on to his son. When he was dying, he said those words to him. We read in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. And usually when a person gives a charge to his son when he's dying, it's usually something honest. You don't want to walk into before God Almighty having a lie on your lips. You want to tell the truth, and you want to say what's really on your heart. So what he says is, so be strong and show yourself a man. That's so important. Be a leader. You can do this. I don't know what Solomon's personality was. I don't know if this came naturally to him. but it was something that was demanded of him. And if it came naturally to him or not, it was still required of him. And it is required of us as men as well, to be strong and to follow the Lord. And so he says, be strong. Show yourself a man. I'm continually dismayed over how the media portrays men as weak and as unnecessary. I was in a store the other day. It was it was one of those kitchen stores. I went in there because Mita went in there. You understand that? It wasn't but I do have to confess, I love to cook. So it's not too manly, but I cook with vigor. Anyway, I slaughtered that chicken, Anyway, but there was a little hot pad, and it had a picture of a lady, probably the picture, tried to, be Art Deco, came back from, the 30s or whatever, and 50s, something like that. And there was this woman there, and she was saying, and could you remind me why it is that I need a man? I thought about that. I said, you know what? That'll sell in this society. That'll sell in this society. Because we've lost sight of what men can be and what they ought to be for women. And how important it is and how much we need to have families where men and women relate to each other the way God intended. He says, be strong. Show yourself a man and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways, even if nobody else will. That's my words. And keep his decrees and commands and his laws and requirements as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you go. So David committed himself to this, and he meant it. He was going to follow through with it. He was going to serve God and allow the Lord to be the king, and he will be the servant of the king as he serves his people as their shepherd. And so he goes to conquer a city. He needs a capital. He needs a capital if Israel is to be united, and there is to be central control and administration of all of these people, these dear people whom he loves, that they might live together in harmony and unity. He needs a city. So he chooses probably the most unlikely city that anybody would choose. First of all, it was a city that they had not been able to conquer. It was a city of the Jebusites, and it was a tremendous fortress, and it was one that, Joshua had a problem with it. In Joshua 15:63 it said, but the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah, could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah into Jerusalem to this day, as it's written in the time of Joshua. So this was an extremely resistant city, and they continued to have their own city and own culture right in the middle of Israel as a kind of a speck in your eye kind of thing, like here we are. God may have told you that we were to be all eradicated, but he couldn't eradicate us. We're still here. And so why would David want to choose a place like that? That is the hardest thing to do. I think sometimes the hardest thing to do is the best thing to do first. Because that means that you got to trust God, and you've got to do the things the way he wants you to do them. It's all about him, not about you. Clearly, this was the place that God had chosen, as we see in subsequent history, as God speaks about Jerusalem as being his city, the place of the temple where he shows his, where he depicts his presence. It doesn't tell us here that God said, go take this city, but I can assume that that was what the Lord had said. So what's wrong with Gibeah? Gibeah would have been a nice city. Saul was king there. Or what's wrong with Hebron? He reigned over that for 7.5 years. People were used to having him there as king. Why this city? If God hadn't said specifically this city, there were other reasons why this was a good city for him to take. It was, first of all, centralized in the whole of the land of Israel. It was accessible to people from north and south. And it was located in northern Israel. Now you say, wait a minute, Jerusalem? Isn't that in Judea? Well, actually, it was just over the border. It was in northern Israel territory. This was huge. And I think the people of northern Israel knew that it was huge. He chose a city that belongs to us, to our territory. David, as I said to you on many occasions, knew and understood people. He knew how they would feel if he had chosen Hebron. They would all the time be thinking that the Judaites would be giving favors that they didn't deserve, and they would always be on the short end of the stick. But somehow David psychologically communicated to them that you are my people too. You see the same kind of wisdom in the book of Acts when there was problems with the distribution of the food to those who were poor there in that time. You remember that the Grecian Jews, Christians, were being neglected in the distribution of the food. And so there was a real problem that needed to be solved. And the apostles went about it in a very diplomatic way. They said, all right, you choose among yourselves 6 men who are of good report, they have good reputations, and that they are filled with the Holy Spirit. You choose them. And you'll notice that the names of the people that were chosen were Greek. And so that really went well with those who were saying, we're not being justly treated, but we can trust these people that are one of us. And so the same kind of thing is going on with David choosing the location of the city that would become the capital of Israel. He wanted a place that would be easily defended in the inner part of the city of Israel, Jerusalem, as it was in the day of the Jebusites, was very easily defensible. It had steep hills on both sides. Going south from the east and on the west, both sides of the city were very difficult to get at. In the southern side, there was a deep ravine. Only from the north was there a plausible way to attack this city. Most cities didn't have this kind of defense system, but this one did. And it was because of this that it was so difficult to take this city. And it required a very miraculous intervention for David to take it himself. Do you remember that there was a water shaft? There was a water shaft from the spring Gihon. The spring Gihon was on the eastern side of the city. It was had been made into an underground spring. It went into the underground area, so there was no above ground access to it. The people within the city had a tunnel going through, mostly carved out because of rain coming through and being water eroding the rock. There was a 50-foot shaft that went down to the spring itself. And I don't know how David found out about this or how he learned about access to it, but he did, because he says here in verse 8, on that day David said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. So David knew of this, and he said, we've got to go in there. Now, it was no easy task to go into this cave, first of all, underwater, into an underground tunnel, then to go up a shaft 50 feet in the dark. I'm sure they did not have headlamps. They were, this was, he had to say to his men, any one of you who goes through this and gets in there and allows us to conquer this city, I'll make you the man in charge. And so Joab, hand rose right up, he's the man. And so he does indeed do that. They get into the city and they open it from the inside and they conquer this town. This is a great place to be because it has water that can be accessed from within. The people don't have to go out when there's an enemy on the outside of the walls. So it's a good city to take, centrally located. And these people, the Jebusites, who were as proud as they were and as defiant as they were, to say to David, even if we only had blind people up here and cripples, we could defend the city against you. Well, David was very much conscious of what God had required of the people of Israel. They were to clean out this land that belonged to them. The people that were in it were to be judged. Their time for judgment had come, and David felt that that was important. And so he took on this city, a very difficult city, and he made it his capital. We're not going to go much further than that, but I want you to just think about this. This is what David was like and what he was doing. How did that all go? We'll see soon. Next week we'll begin with his protecting that city. But David does well with establishing a government and establishing a place that is the capital of Israel. It is a place that God claims as his own. As David moves the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, he makes it a place not only of the rule and administration of Israel, he makes it a place of worship, because the two of them, in his way of thinking and in the way in which each of us should think, should never be separated. What we do and whom we worship should be integrated together totally. And so David began this way. Now we'll see that this all, after just a very few generations, comes apart at the seams. It seems like, God, you are starting a wonderful thing here, and then all of a sudden it comes apart. And in fact, it goes to the place where you need to judge the people by bringing in armies from enemies who take them off into captivity, and they are deported from the land. What happened? Why did this all fail? Wasn't this going to be your city, your temple, your seat of worship and government for Israel? Why? Lord, weren't you able to make it happen? Because what we see going on oft times in the Old Testament are structures and principles that are begun there to help the children of Israel and us as believers to understand the ways in which God works. He talks about a government, he talks about himself ruling, he talks about a temple and us being worshiping of him. And all of it truly is not to be forever. It is something that's pointing forward to something that will be eternal, and that is in heaven. And we read about this in Revelation 21, about a city coming down from heaven. And it's called Jerusalem. It is the city of God. And it is populated with his children. Because you see, a city, a capital city, is not just buildings. It is the people of God within those buildings. And God is telling us that even though this may have had a good beginning and that it collapsed, this is only to share with you that men can't do this. Because of the sin inside men's hearts, it will always end in failure. But when I do it, and when I bring into this the people that I have saved and redeemed and declared not guilty, and then I will completely eradicate sin from their lives, it will become an eternal going home to the city of our God, where we will live forever and ever. What men cannot do, Jesus Christ has done, and we will see the fruits of it in the future. And so that is why we close our service with this song, When He Shall Come. Take your hymnals and let us sing it together.